Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. My colleague and friend and co-host Gordon Chang joins me. He's traveling this evening. He is in Canada. Gordon, a very good evening to you. The question before us these last months, Gordon, are we witnessing, are we experiencing an aggression that's discontinuous from the past from the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping? There's not one answer, Gordon, but you recently highlighted the CCTV celebration lunar year television extravaganza in China. And I believe you found that that was sentimental and operatic and melodramatic, but there was a theme that suggests that the military is a new player. How so, Gordon?
Many people are saying, John, that the military themes during the Lunar New Year Gala, which is this 5-hour program, which should be lighthearted entertainment, all of these military themes were meant to appease the People's Liberation Army. And if that's true, that's very concerning, because it means that Xi Jinping may not be as powerful as we think he is, and that Xi Jinping may have to be really taking orders from the generals and admirals.
There is a 21st century battle landscape. It's all theoretical, yes, it's scenarios. Iran is now much in the news, Syria is much in the news, but neither Iran nor Syria nor the two together offer a symmetrical warfare threat to the scale necessary to inhibit or in any way push back the United States Navy in the Pacific. It's not possible. Iran and Syria are, and I do not mean to disdain, I'm just trying to calibrate this. I'm told fourth-rate, fifth-rate, sixth-rate powers. They're very good at brutalizing people they can reach, that is, their own people, but projecting power, not. We welcome Harry Kazianis, who is the managing editor at the National Interest and a non-resident fellow at the China Policy Institute, posting most recently in the Washington Times a measure of the Chinese military threat, a symmetrical warfare unit of a scale, I'm told, that is increasingly capable of contesting or worrying the U.S. fleet in Asia. Harry, a very good evening to you. East China Sea, South China Sea. What we've seen over these last months can be described as a man with a big belly sticking it farther and farther out to take more and more territory to make larger and larger claims, or slicing salami, especially in the East China Sea. That could be a prelude to trouble, or it could be the policy itself, and we'll continue that as long as possible. How do you see it, Harry? Good evening to you.
Good evening, gentlemen. Well, I think it's an interesting scenario that's built up over the last couple of years. I mean, you have these Chinese, as you mentioned, salami slicing tactics in the East China Sea, and as well now as in the South China Sea. As you'll both recall, in 2012, the Chinese essentially took Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. You had very interesting comments, I believe, today in the New York Times from the Philippines president, basically comparing the taking of Scarborough Shoal to the Sudetenland in the prelude before World War II. So I think for U.S. policymakers, they have to ask a number of questions. Is this a long-term strategy, and how long can the Chinese effectively do this? My piece in the Washington Times basically points to the growing power of the Chinese military through a number of different means, through their growing naval capabilities, stealth fighters, cyber capabilities, space capabilities. If they are ever challenged in any specific way, they would have a number of different ways, symmetrically and asymmetrically, to strike, and it's a very troubling trend.
Gordon?
Harry, in your piece in the Washington Times, which is really terrific, by the way, you outlined the various Chinese threats. One of them really, I thought, was fascinating, and that is, of course, that the Chinese submarine surfaced itself very close to the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft carrier. It wasn't detected until it hit the surface. This would seem to me to be a mortal threat to American carrier battle groups. Essentially, you've got 10 ships in the U.S. Navy. Those are the aircraft carriers. Most of the rest of the ships are really auxiliaries in one sense or another. So once you have the Chinese submarines being able to take down a U.S. carrier, the question is, what do we have left?
That's an excellent question, Gordon. Well, I think that point is very telling for a number of factors. Number one, how close they were actually able to get. And as you pointed out, they were not able to be detected until they actually came to the surface. As I'm sure your listeners know, and a lot of Navy folks will tell you out there, in a real wartime scenario, any submarine is not going to surface before it strikes. And I think we also need to keep in mind as well, modern submarines today are not going to use the standard torpedoes of the World War II era. Chinese submarines are armed with very powerful cruise missiles that would be able to strike, just about 100 miles away. So, God forbid if there was any situation like this in the future, they would not get the opportunity to see a Chinese vessel surface. So it is very disturbing.
Harry, we need a timeline. First island chain, check. Second island chain, when? And how big is the plan? Are they looking to patrol their own seas, protect the sea lanes, challenge the U.S., intimidate Japan, or are they moving out into the Pacific?
It's a very good question. Well, I think we have to look at the individual capabilities the Chinese are developing. I think one very troubling trend that has just gotten play in the media just very recently is all this talk about a hypersonic glide vehicle. Just to break that down to your listeners, basically it was a test that was done a few weeks ago where this very almost space-age sounding vehicle was put aboard a very large rocket, an intercontinental ballistic missile, if you will, launched into space and basically came down through Chinese territory. Just to break that down, what it could do, that type of weapon would basically come down on its target at Mach 10, very, very fast. For U.S. missile defenses, what that means is they would have very little time to respond if there was ever a crisis situation. So to go back to your original question, I think it really depends on the situation and whatever you want to deem Chinese grand strategy to be. I think it's very, very simple. In the event of a crisis, whether we're talking Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, if there was ever a situation where they wanted to push U.S. forces out, they would have a host of all of these almost sci-fi sounding weapons, carrier killer missiles, this now hypersonic vehicle, building aircraft carriers, silent submarines, all these things where they have the capabilities to do that.
Gordon?
Harry, people have said that a hypersonic vehicle really is the game changer, and that the country that develops this weapon first will dominate the world's militaries. So it seems to me that we've got a lot at stake here in terms of this Chinese hypersonic glide vehicle, because if we don't figure out how to counter it, we could really be in trouble.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think, even myself, I'll be honest, as somebody who tracks these type of things for a living, I was very surprised because there's very little talk about this in the media or even just peer-reviewed journal articles and just the more defense press that the Chinese were developing. There was inklings, but there was never anything about a test. Now, as people will tell you, the United States is also developing this technology. And it's very interesting. Actually, within the last 24 to 48 hours, articles have actually started coming out where the United States is actually working on a submarine-launched version of this. So I think policymakers and our own defense analysis are sort of waking up to the challenges that we face in the Asia-Pacific and are hopefully developing a counter-strategy to make sure, that things stay stable.
Harry, I mean to be polite, but I want to put you on the spot. How long? 10 years? 20 years? What is the plan to go toe-to-toe, old-fashioned movie expression, with the U.S. Navy in the Pacific?
Well, here's the thing. I'm gonna answer it this way. It all depends on the capabilities of China's economy. Because as Gordon's pointed out many times on the show, I mean, China's economy and the power that it gives it, now the second largest economy in the world, enables it to build that advanced military. So the challenge is this: if that economy can keep churning, that will give them more capabilities. How long? I mean, if we look at 2020, there's been a lot of research that's come out recently that actually by 2020, the average Chinese soldier will actually have a higher education level than a comparable U.S. soldier. So that is troubling. Other studies have shown that actually by 2020, the Chinese military will actually be as capable as the U.S. military. So you could kind of unpack that in two ways. One, you could say, well, they're 20 years behind. But also, you have to kind of ask yourself, how much different is those 20 years? I mean, the United States currently uses a lot of technology from the Cold War, F-16s, F-18s. So how much difference is there? It's tough to tell. The scale between both militaries is narrowing, and it's narrowing very quickly.
Harry Kazianis, Managing Editor, National Interest. He's a non-resident fellow at the China Policy Institute. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com, my colleague. I'm John Batchelor.